Here.
Paul Johnson.
Here.
Cheryl Kasluga. Richard Wallace.
Here.
Rebecca Wolf.
I see her, but she's on mute.
She's on mute.
Oh, she just waved.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Let's begin the meeting. We have some information that my sucker would like to go over. I believe we all received the email about the upcoming project.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With us today, of course, is Christine Shale, our counsel, as well as Mark Taylor with Contra Associates, the firm that prepared the appraisal value, and we will have him give us a brief overview of that and get any of your questions. But first, I wanted to just review the email that I received from Joe Scott, who's the counsel for David Kessler, the developer of 620 Union property, indicating that they received the copy of the report, which I had sent them after sending it to each of you, and that they had hoped to be able to review it and make their pilot proposal in time for this meeting, but they didn't want to appear to be getting it to us yesterday and expecting us to absorb it or respond to it. So they're going to continue to refine it and get it to us by July 3rd. I may ask them to get it to us by July 1st. And then the idea would be that we would have a conversation about their application and their proposed pilot terms at our July meeting, which is not yet scheduled. We don't normally have meetings in July, but presumably that would be Tuesday, July 14th, pending people's schedule. So one of the things that I also sent out that Chris will address is I took some generic IDA procedures that she would like to just clarify and amend just a little bit as it relates to what Hudson has done in the past. But to enable Mark Taylor to just give us a brief explanation of what his assignment was, how he approached it, and what his result was, then we can let him get back to his business independent of the IDA. Mark?
Thanks, Mike. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the CEDC reached out to me to produce an appraisal report to get an idea of what a reasonable assessment would be for given the proposed project, assuming total completion of the proposed project. This isn't my first time doing a hotel appraisal in the city or in other areas. So I did have a wealth of knowledge already gathered. So did some more research, expanded upon that, selected the 4 most likely comparable sales, 2 of those being within the city. It produced a evaluation upon that. Mike was analyzing a lot of stuff on a per room basis, which can be done, but in the valuation perspective, given the amount of excess square footage that is in a hotel that's delineated to other things besides the rooms, it made more sense to analyze the comparable sales on a per square foot basis, which is what I did in my assignment. Mike, has everybody reviewed this? Did they receive it themselves or?
Everyone has received it. I think that based on your giving us a brief summary, we'll be able to review it more carefully. I think everyone's taking a look at it. But
so with every property, you have a value range, and the hardest thing to do is to point an exact number on a property, especially when you're dealing with a situation like this. So in my appraisal here, you'll see on page 29 where the sales comparison grid is, there at the bottom of the sales comparison grid kind of explores the value range from the 3.1 to the 3.6. However, given the market in the city of Hudson, in the current climate, I erred a little bit towards the lower end because that's where there was one end that was bringing it up to the 3.6, but I didn't feel that was very realistic. So I wanted to make this the most realistic valuation possible. So that's where I reconciled that the $3,150,000 value. Now, typically, given an appraisal like this, we also do an income approach. However, being that there is no data to go off of at this current time, that wasn't realistic for this assignment. So this assignment was developed solely on the sales comparison approach. Are there any specific questions yet, or anything more you'd like me to cover, Mike?
I guess, how did you review or integrate the value of the other hotel properties as comparables, or did you just completely do it by square foot?
When the value of the other hotel properties, you mean the other properties within the city that are hotels?
Yes. I know you had, I think, the Barlow and the Rivertown and the St. Charles. There was a hotel or two out of the county. There's one in Saratoga, I think, too.
Yeah, see the Barlow and the St. Charles haven't sold. So we can't go off of what assessed values are. We have to go off of real actual sales to develop. So St. Charles.
So I guess when you take into account the city's reval, were they in essence appraisals done at that time?
I'm not sure if it's my connection or yours, Mike, but
The girl said she was trying to find out when you was getting the ham, the mustard glazed ham.
Mark, I guess the question
It's taking
is.
a long time just to give me an answer.
People have to.
Hey, Tiffany?
Tiffany, can you
Tiffany, can you mute your phone?
I'm sorry.
I guess my question is, when they did the reval of the city 2 years ago, would you assume that they valued it, that while there were no sales of the Barlow or the St. Charles, that there was some logical valuation to it?
Well, there had to be they had to have some basis to put it on. I can't really speak to what they did. That's why we don't utilize assessment data, because you can't speak to other people's work, and you can't. So I honestly don't know how they came up with their valuations.
The interesting thing is that as Mark said, I looked at it from a per room rather than the per square foot. The Barlow comes out at $60,000 a room. The St. Charles was around $56,000 a room, and the Rivertown was like $47,000 a room, and that the $3,150,000 divided by 50 rooms comes out to a little over $62,000 a room. So, while that's not necessarily the most accurate way to do it based on how large the rooms are and what other amenities there might be on the property, it was interesting to me that the three existing properties that are on the tax rolls appeared to be in the $55,000 average range, and this is at $62,000 based on Mark's report. Again, it doesn't, if it was an up and running hotel that had just sold to a new buyer, it'd be a much easier way of determining what its value was. Are there any questions for the board, Madam Chair?
This is Heather. I have a question.
Go ahead, Evan.
I'm just curious. So the assessed value in this appraisal, which implies the completed property, is relatively close to the actual sales price for the property as is. And I know to an extent you can say that the additional amount of building out the property is an investment that has to get paid back and won't necessarily be reflected in the appraisal value. But I'm just curious how those two elements play together.
I think the current assessment is $1.7 million. So this is double.
I mean, I understand they have a sales contract on the property, but there's no way to say that they're paying market value for that, but maybe they're paying more than market value for the property. We weren't tasked with figuring out the current of the property, because let's face it, the property in its current state needs significant work in order to make it even somewhat habitable.
I think the current assessment is around $1.7 million. I think the purchase contract that you uncovered was close to 2.2. Is that right, Mark?
I actually think it was more than that.
Okay.
Hold on, let me just go to that page of my report. $2.5.
All right. But again, I guess, Chris, could you comment on the fact that our job is not to set the assessment? It was only for illustration purposes.
That's correct. I think you were looking for what is the value to understand what is the likely tax without a pilot, if in fact the building were built without a pilot, which is a question, of course, right?
And could we get that amount? Could we get that value?
The appraisal that Mark just came up with is 3.1 million after renovation, correct?
3.1.
That's correct.
And that's consistent with the value on an average individual room basis of the other 3 properties in town. Or a comparable value. But again,
Any
that's,
other questions?
sorry, Tiffany.
I was asking the board if they had any questions.
I'm not sure we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was asking if the board had any other questions for the gentleman that was speaking.
Well, Mark will be available at other times if you do. And I just wanted to have him give you a sense of where we were on the report.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, Mike, if you want to share my contact information, if anybody has any questions, they can reach out directly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, have a good day, everybody.
Madam Chair, the only other thing I had was to ask Chris Shell to walk us through the process, because I had taken the process on a quick cut and paste basis to give a general outline from the City of Yonkers IDA. And Chris and I had a conversation, and there's some things in that process, while they're representative of the process, aren't exactly how it's done in Hudson. Chris?
So the purpose of this is to see what changes we want to make compared to what Yonkers IDA has?
No, I think in the first instance, it was just to, what are the steps in this overall process because there was a question, when does the board actually make the decision? And there's quite a few steps in that process before we get there.
Okay.
And the second piece is I did include at Rebecca Wolf's suggestion, matrix that were used in Clinton County, which is Plattsburgh, Orange County, which is Newburgh, and Ulster County, which is Kingston. in evaluating pilot agreements as a sample and example for you as a separate conversation.
Okay.
Chris, you're on mute.
Myself. So the matrix issue, Michael, would go to if they wanted to reevaluate their pilot policy that's in place right now, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, so that's sort of, as you said, that's a separate issue from any given application, but of course you can consider that anytime. All right, so Michael sent you some procedures, which I think we actually have talked about already. We have the application from the applicant, which I think that they have submitted, and I believe that staff has determined that it was complete as far as the documentation, but I believe that they are looking at that again. Is that correct, Michael? And they're going to be confirming that this is the application they want you to use for the evaluation?
Well, we accepted an application, and what I said to them this week was, since the passage of time, it's been 4 months since we had that application. If there was anything they wanted to amend in that application, because I consider it already submitted, that they should let us know at the same time that they submit their proposed pilot. Certain numbers may have changed, certain aspects of the project may have changed, and rather than proceed on the basis of something they gave us 3 months ago, I asked them to review it carefully and indicate if there are any amendments to it before we proceed.
So the other part of that we need, that I perceive to be part of the application that we are waiting for, is for them to explain. They've told us they want a deviation from our pilot policy, but they haven't presented exactly what they want to ask us for. So we are still waiting for them to present what they want to propose as their deviation. So that we heard from their counsel, I think yesterday, right, Michael, that they wanted another week or so to think about that and get us a proposal, correct?
Right, and part of that was our fault because we misunderstood when we would have the appraiser's report, and with falling within tax certiorari week and grievance week, he wasn't able to get it to us on the same schedule that we had indicated both to the board and the developer.
So once we have that, Michael, I think, would be able to then undertake an analysis, not personally, but using the firm that the CEDC uses, an analysis of the economic impact, taking into account the factors that are stated in the application, such as the amount of employment that is proposed to be generated, and the amount of sales taxes and other economic impacts of the project, and then that off against the benefits that they're asking for, such as a sales tax exemption on materials, and mortgage tax exemption to the extent that they ask for that, and of course the pilot that they're looking for. So that analysis is something that Michael would do. Once we have essentially a proposal, then that's what we're ready to call a public hearing about. So we would look for comment on this particular proposal. And that's when we would, you would hear from the public, as well as obviously the board having an opportunity to weigh in and ask questions, further questions. And then at that point, you'd be in a position to make a decision about the project. You probably wouldn't make a decision at that very meeting. You would, typically we would have you listen to the comments, take an opportunity to then reflect on those comments, and then come back and consider it at a later meeting. Consider the request for approval.
Rebecca, does it address the questions that you had in terms of how this process works?
Yes, definitely. Although, actually, I'm sorry, I'm in a domestic space today that is making it hard for me to fully follow what you just said in terms of the application is considered complete at this point from.
In terms of the paperwork, yes, but they have asked us to consider a deviation, but we need to hear from them what it is that they are looking for, right? The normal pilot policy, we could evaluate the normal pilot policy, but they've said they want us to consider a deviation. So, okay, what deviation?
Is there any hint about that, or is it just?
I don't.
I think that, basically, those of you, I guess, Heather is really the only one still on the board who was here when we went through the WIC negotiations. And, basically, if you look at the WIC, their pilot was the pilot that was approved by the board at that time, was very aggressive. But again, they were going into an area in a part of town that they were really true pioneers in. So, I think those documents are public record. So a developer is going to look and say, oh, what have they done before? I've cautioned them from the beginning that, I did not see this board at this point in time or with this property being willing to consider a deviation as perhaps as, if you want to characterize it, as generous as the WIC. But again, until there was some sense of what the value range was, it was hard for them to be able to run the numbers using the tax rates that are in place now. The interesting thing is when the WIC pilot was done, the tax rates were $10 a thousand higher. They're in the $36 range when I went back and looked at at least that's what the analysis was done at. So, I think that some of the questions are, if you remember with the WIC, the IDA agreed that they could pay 60% of what was due the first year, then 65, then 70, then 75, to a point where you got out to year 5, and then they were paying 100, 110, 115% of what was due. And on a present value basis, analyzing the time use of money, it was the same dollar amount, but in this case, it would be hard to do that because, as the treasurer points out, the current assessment results in $45,000 a year in taxes. If you use the value just for illustrative purposes from the report of 3.15, and you take the current tax rate and 50% of that rate, you get almost the same taxes it's paying now. And you certainly, would not, IDAs generally don't agree to pilots that start at a rate lower than where the property is now. So, I think they are kind of, having to look at, where they think they need to be from a development standpoint. And then this analysis that Chris mentions is done by the Center for Government Research in Rochester. They do this for IDAs all over the state. We pay $500 a year to access their software, but they will take into account as well on a $12 million project, the $120,000 day one fee to the IDA. They'll take in, the estimated $40,000 or $50,000 a year in bed tax, the $15,000 a year in the city's 15% share of the county's portion of the sales tax. And, then you take an analysis to see, based on how many jobs they're creating and the benefits you're going to receive through IDA fees and taxes, how much you're giving them, and you'll get a clearer picture of how much it is. It's not simply the benefit they receive, it's the analysis of the community benefit that they bring to the project through jobs and other monetary contributions to the city.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
So from the beginning, we've been talking about, how they can articulate the benefits.
Is wrapping up in 5 minutes. Can I call you back?
Like how clearly can they articulate what those benefits to the community will look like in terms specifically around jobs?
Right.
And I haven't seen a part of the application that describes specifics around local hiring practices and workforce training and those kinds of issues.
Okay, so we'll certainly have them include that in their deviation proposal, and also an estimate based on, if you took 50 rooms at 50% occupancy, so 25 rooms at $200 a night, you're going to have a certain dollar amount times 4% bed tax. I mean, you can estimate those things. You'll never, if they're at 40% occupancy, you won't get as much as you will if they're at 60% occupancy. But those other estimates of what they're contributing, that would reduce the value of the benefit, because if you don't give them the benefit, you'll never realize the tax generation or the fee or the jobs or the training program. So, it's a big picture analysis. So I think, the only thing is not to get, until we are able to put all that together and you're comfortable that the assumptions are not only realistic, but are truthful, we really won't be able to see what that net benefit to them is from you. But it's not a $250,000 in pilot dollars. It's not plus 125 in, if you add up the benefits that the IDA could give them, it could be $500,000 or $600,000. But you need to net out what they're bringing to you that you wouldn't get if they didn't come.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mike, can you say anything about, I'm sorry. Am I out of order or in order?
Go forward, Rebecca, and ask your question.
Can you say anything about the implications of the appraisal that we just received, like in terms of what that big picture?
I guess the reality is the assessor for the city could put any appraisal that they determined was appropriate on it. They would then have gone and hired a firm like this, develop a report to challenge it if it was higher than what they thought the property's value was. And then you'd have a board of appeals review it. And then if they weren't satisfied, they would go to court. So, I think that report is a good example of what they would have received from a professional appraiser as to what they would use to get negotiate an assessment if the assessor had made it higher. Heather, can you, since the assessor isn't here, is there a different perspective on that from city financial standpoint?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. There aren't, as they said, there aren't a lot of hotel sales, so it's hard to know what the true market value of it's going to be. Like I said, I find it a little odd that somebody can invest $10 million into a project and have the final valuation be $3 million. That seems like a super really long break even in my mind, but
when we go back to the WIC, they initially invested 8.5 and the appraisal was 1.7. So, I guess it's something for this board to continue to review and consider, and ultimately the assessor is going to have to opine on what the value of it is.
So are you saying that we still have the ability as a board to essentially not reject, but to offer a different conclusion in terms of.
The conclusion is that I think, Chris has cautioned me because putting a value in the formula to calculate what the tax is necessary to get to that value. But this board doesn't set that value. Is that correct, Chris?
Right. The purpose of the exercise is to try to figure out how to do the analysis, the before and after analysis of, and you have to make some assumptions, right, about, would the project go forward? If the project doesn't go forward, what would you get right now based on current taxes versus if the project does go forward, what's the economic impact to the city and what are the tax impacts and what portion of that tax are you essentially having them not pay in order to induce them to come into the city?
And the other thing that I would add is that I think one of the issues with the WIC pilot was that it didn't ramp up, in my opinion, adequately enough. So when their pilot period is over, they're going to have a significant leap. And I think one thing, if and when we look at the deviation and when we run it through the analysis, the other thing I would like to see is how close they get to what their actual taxes would be once the pilot is over, because otherwise everybody's getting set up for a default. I mean, if they're not going to be able to afford, let's say the valuation really is $3.1 million. So their tax on that would be roughly $83,000, of which roughly $24,000 would come to the city. If they're not going to be able to afford that once their pilot's up, then that's an issue as well. So that's something I'd like to personally make sure that we take a look at when we look at the pilot schedule.
And I think you're absolutely right, because the WIC pilot is an absolute deviation in that the IDA agreed to a fixed payment for 10 years. And the model that was created from was for the 485, the 50% discount based on the $1.7 million assessment, but both the tax rate and the assessment were frozen. So, on $1.75 million at 2% annual increase in assessed value and a 2% tax increase, when it goes back on the market, they're going to have, what did we at one point figured, Heather, almost 50%, a 50% increase in their taxes. And then how do they do that without coming back in and begging for more, which there's going to be no process to do that.
Can I ask another question? Or unless, are we, I don't want to.
I mean, Madam Chair, Rebecca has another question.
Is there any part of what we're doing here that would include some kind of, I don't know, way to say this, but like, so a hotel developer could develop a hotel and then sell it to, for example, Marriott or something, and thereby, and I don't know at what point that changes what happens to their pilot. Like what is the interaction of a pilot with an eventual sale?
So Mike, can I address that? So a couple of things. Typically, any pilot agreement that you enter into is going to be coupled with financial agreement whereby the developer agrees to certain things as a condition. Some of those things have to do with constructing the stated improvement, constructing the thing that they said they were going to build, running the thing they said they were going to build, but they're always able to sell the facility. It doesn't mean that they can sell it and turn it into something else, but it means that they can sell it to a different owner. You're not providing assistance to a particular owner. Now, there is also typically some language that would say that it has to be someone who is at least as financially, has at least the financial capability as the original owner, because obviously you don't want it to be, sold and then not run for the economic benefits that you were hoping for. So you will see things like that, but you won't be able to control necessarily who the owner is. Now, when it comes to, I don't know if you're thinking about franchise issues, but I mean, those issues tend to be planning board issues, not IDA issues, right? The issue of whether or not that creates an economic impact is not the same as this is not the way I want my city to look, which is really a planning issue and really more appropriate for the planning and comp plan, discussion, I think, right?
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
Great. Madam Chair, I didn't have anything else. I don't know, did you, Chris?
Well, if there isn't anything else, because my phone is definitely getting ready to die. Rebecca, do you have any more questions?
Just Mike, so now we have this sample of a matrix to look at, and so now we can refine it for our own IDA now that we have.
So I'm going to suggest that you go back and look at your own pilot policy, because that's the context for that, right? And maybe this is a sort of an offline discussion of, does the IDA want to re-examine that policy? Start with looking at the one that you have, and then Michael's giving you some examples of how other people are approaching this, right? Yeah. Okay. Because the policy should reflect your priorities, the city's priorities, right?
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, before I get cut off, if there isn't anything else, and if anyone has any ideas or questions that may pop up after this meeting, please feel free to email myself, and I can relate the message to Chris or Mike, depending on what the questions are. And if there aren't anything else, may I have a motion to adjourn, please?
So moved.
Seconded.
Any all in favor?
Aye.
Yes.
Okay. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.